There comes a moment in life when you realize your family has stopped believing in you. For 72-year-old Aura Mirsi, that moment came when they laughed at her dream of building a tree cabin in the northern woods. They called it foolish, a waste of her time. But Aura carried something they didn't know about a blueprint her son had drawn 30 years ago, before he disappeared without a word. So she walked into the forest alone and started building. What she created wasn't just a cabin, it was something that called to people, that pulled them back, whether they wanted to come or not. One by one, her family returned, drawn by curiosity and something deeper. What was it about that cabin that wouldn't let them stay away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Aura Mirsi had lived 72 years in the valley below the northern pines, and for most of those years, she'd been content. She'd raised 3 children in a farmhouse, her husband built with his own hands. She'd buried that husband 10 years back, mourned him proper, and learned to live with the quiet that followed. The farmhouse sat at the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to dirt roads, where neighbors still waved from their porches and knew your business before you did. She'd been a good mother, everyone said so. Kept a clean house, cooked meals that filled the belly and warmed the heart, attended every school concert and baseball game. Her daughter Pauline was the oldest, sharp-tongued and practical, married to a dentist in the next county. Her son Gordon came second, steady and serious, running an insurance office in town. And then there was Emmett. Emmett had been her youngest, born when she was 39, and thought she was done with babies. He'd come into the world during a thunderstorm, and from his first breath, he'd been different from the dollar. Others, where Pauline calculated and Gordon followed rules, Emmett wandered. He'd disappear into the woods for hours as a boy, coming home with pockets full of interesting stones and sketches of birds. His teachers called him creative. His father called him unfocused. Aura called him hers. The northern forest had been Emmett's favorite place. When he was small, Aura would take him there on Saturday mornings while his father worked the fields. She'd grown up running wild in those same woods, back when her own grandmother told stories of the old days, of settlers who'd built deep in the pines where the land was rich and the world was quiet. Aura had loved those stories, and she'd pass them to Emmett like an inheritance made of words and wonder. He'd sketch everything, trees, animals, the way light fell through leaves. But his favorite drawing, the one he kept coming back to, was a tree cabin. Not a tree house like children build, but a proper cabin built between living trees, something that would grow with the forest itself. He'd shown it to her when he was 16, the blueprint careful and detailed, marked with measurements and notes about how the trees would support the structure. "One day, Mama," he'd said, his eyes bright with a dreamer's certainty, "one day, I'm going to build this, a place between earth and sky." She'd smiled and tucked the drawing away, thinking it was the kind of promise young people make before life teaches them different. But Emmett hadn't let it go. He'd talked about it through high school, through the years he'd worked construction with his father, through the restless period in his early 20s when he couldn't seem to settle into anything. And then, 30 years ago, when Emmett was 23 years old, he'd vanished. Not dramatically, not with warning or goodbye. He'd left for work one Tuesday morning in April, kissed Aura's cheek like always, and simply never came home. His truck was found 3 days later at a trailhead, leading into the northern forest. His wallet was missing, his work boots were gone, but there was no note, no explanation, no body. The search had lasted 2 weeks. Volunteers combed the forest, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. The sheriff brought in dogs. Helicopters circled overhead. But the forest kept its secrets, and Emmett Mirsi became another name on a missing persons list, another family's unfinished grief. Aura's husband had died of a heart attack 5 years after Emmett disappeared, and Aura always believed it was the not knowing that had killed him. Gordon had grown harder, more rigid in his routines, as if structure could prevent more loss. Pauline had grown bitter, speaking of Emmett rarely and always with an edge of anger, as if he'd chosen to leave them. But Aura had carried the grief different. She'd kept Emmett's room exactly as he'd left it. She'd maintained his truck, starting it once a month so the engine wouldn't seize. And she'd kept that blueprint, the drawing of the tree cabin, folded in her Bible, where she'd see it every Sunday. For 30 years, she'd wondered. For 30 years, she'd held a question in her heart that had no answer. Then, 6 months ago, something had shifted in her. Maybe it was turning 72 and feeling the weight of years. Maybe it was the way her children treated her, like she was fragile, like she was finished. Maybe it was waking up one morning and realizing she'd spent 3 decades waiting for a son who would never walk back through her door. She'd pulled out Emmett's blueprint and really looked at it for the first time in years. She'd traced the careful lines he'd drawn, read his notes about foundation points and support beams, and she'd made a decision. She would build it. She would take her son's dream and make it real. When she'd announced it at Sunday dinner 2 months back, the reaction had been immediate and unanimous. Pauline had laughed outright, a sharp bark of disbelief. "Mother, that's ridiculous. You're 72 years old. You can't go building cabins in the woods like some what?" Aura had asked quietly. "Like it's not a foolish waste of time," Pauline had finished, her jaw set. "It's a child's fantasy. Emmett drew that when he was 16. It doesn't mean anything." Gordon had been gentler but no more encouraging. "Mom, I understand you miss him. We all do. But this isn't practical. The forest is dangerous for someone your age. What if you fell? What if you got hurt?" "I raised 3 children," Aura had said. "I ran a farm. I buried a husband. I think I can manage some carpentry." "It's not about capability," Gordon had insisted, his insurance agent voice coming out, the one he used to explain policy details to difficult clients. "It's about safety, about making smart choices." Only her granddaughter Faye had been quiet during the argument. She was Pauline's daughter, 28, and working as a teacher in the Valley. She'd sat at the end of the table, watching Aura with an expression that might have been concern or might have been something else. The dinner had ended badly. Pauline had called it chasing ghosts. Gordon had tried to reason, to compromise, to suggest they all go camping together instead. But Aura had already made up her mind, and once Aura Mirsi decided something, the decision was made. She'd spent the next 6 weeks preparing. She'd gone through Emmett's old things, finding not just the blueprint but notebooks filled with his observations about the forest, sketches of trees, notes about soil composition and water drainage. He'd been more thorough than she'd realized, more serious about his dream. She'd gathered tools, some from her own shed, some borrowed from neighbors who didn't ask too many questions. She'd bought supplies from the hardware store in town, ignoring the curious looks when she'd loaded her truck with lumber and nails. She'd packed camping gear, food that would keep, a first aid kit, and warm clothes for the mountain nights. And she'd taken the blueprint, now laminated and protected, along with a leather journal she'd kept since Emmett's disappearance. For 30 years, she'd written to him in that journal letters she could never send, observations about the changing seasons, questions that had no answers. It had become a habit, a way to keep him close when everything else about him had faded into memory. Her last night in the farmhouse, she'd walked through the rooms in the dark, touching familiar walls and furniture. She'd stopped in Emmett's room, sitting on his bed like she used to when he was small and couldn't sleep. The room still smelled faintly of him, though that was probably her imagination. She'd whispered to the darkness, "I'm going to build it, baby. I'm going to make your dream real." The morning she left, she'd walked past Gordon's car parked in her driveway. He'd tried one more time to talk her out of it. She'd waved without stopping, her pack on her back, Emmett's blueprint in her pocket, and headed toward the northern forest where the pines grew thick and the world still held mysteries. The trailhead, where Emmett's truck had been found all those years ago, had a new parking lot now, paved and marked with signs about wilderness safety. Aura had stood there for a long moment, looking at the forest edge, remembering the search parties, the helicopters, the desperate hope that had slowly died. Then she'd adjusted her pack and walked into the trees. The forest had welcomed her like an old friend. The smell of pine and earth filled her lungs. The sound of wind through branches was better than any music. She'd grown up in these woods, played in them as a girl, explored them with Emmett. When he was young, she knew the paths, the landmarks, the way the land rose and fell. But she wasn't following the main trails. Emmett's blueprint had included a map, rough but detailed, showing a specific grove deep in the forest. He'd marked it with coordinates and descriptions, where 3 ancient pines grow in a triangle, near the old creek that runs in spring, where the ground is level and the view opens to the west. It had taken her 2 days of hiking to find it, 2 days of sleeping in a tent and waking to birdsong, 2 days of feeling more alive than she had in years. And when she'd found the grove, when she'd stood in the exact spot Emmett had described, she'd known. This was the place. This was where her son's dream belonged. The 3 pines were massive, old-growth trees that had stood for centuries. They formed a natural triangle, their trunks thick and strong, their branches spreading wide overhead. The ground between them was level, carpeted with pine needles, and the western view opened to a vista of rolling forest that stretched to the horizon. Aura had set down her pack, pulled out the blueprint, and begun. That first night, alone in the forest with nothing but her tent and the stars overhead, she'd read Emmett's blueprint by lantern light. His handwriting covered the margins, notes about stress points, ideas about using the living trees as support posts, sketches of how the cabin would grow with the forest. He'd thought of everything, planned every detail. She'd traced the lines of his drawing with one finger and felt the weight of 30 years pressing on her chest. Where had he gone? Why had he left? Had he been planning to build this cabin himself, or had it just been a dream he'd never meant to realize? The questions were old companions, familiar as grief and just as unanswerable. But she had the blueprint. She had her hands. She had time and determination and a promise she'd made to herself in the darkness of her farmhouse. She would build this cabin. She would honor her son's vision. And maybe, in the building, she'd find some kind of peace. The forest settled around her that night, full of small sounds and gentle movements. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The wind whispered through the pines, and Aura Mircea, 72 years old and stubborn as the trees themselves, closed her eyes and dreamed of building something that would last. The work began at dawn. Aura had always been an early riser, a habit formed from decades of farm life, and the forest seemed to approve. The morning light filtered through the pine canopy in golden shafts, illuminating the grove like a cathedral. She made coffee on her camp stove, ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit, and pulled out Emmett's blueprint once more. The design was elegant in its simplicity. The 3 pines would serve as the primary support structure, with the cabin platform built between them at a height of about 8 feet high enough to avoid ground moisture and animals, low enough to be practical. The walls would incorporate the trees themselves, allowing them to continue growing through the structure. The roof would be angled to shed rain and snow, with skylights positioned to catch the morning sun. It was ambitious, it was beautiful, and it was exactly the kind of thing Emmett would have dreamed up. Aura spent the first morning surveying the site, walking the perimeter with a measuring tape and a notebook. She recorded the exact dimensions between the 3 trees, checked the ground level, and tested the soil drainage by digging small test holes. Everything matched Emmett's notes with eerie precision. Either he'd been here and surveyed this exact spot, or he'd described it so accurately that she'd found his dream location by instinct. The thought made her chest tighten. Had he stood here? Had he measured these same trees? Had he imagined the cabin rising between them the way she was imagining it now? By mid-morning, she'd begun marking the foundation points. The platform would need support posts driven into the ground at strategic locations to supplement the tree's natural strength. She'd brought a post hole digger, and despite her age, her muscles remembered this kind of work. Her late husband had taught her carpentry basics, and she'd helped him build enough fences and outbuildings to know her way around construction. The first hole went easily, the soil soft from recent rain. The second and third followed without trouble. But when she started on the fourth hole, the one closest to the largest pine, her digger struck something solid about 2 feet down. She assumed it was a rock. The forest was full of them, ancient stones pushed up by frost and root systems. She worked the digger around the obstruction, trying to pry it loose. But when she finally got leverage and pulled, what came up wasn't a rock, it was metal. Tarnished, dirt-encrusted, but definitely metal. Aura knelt in the pine needles and brushed the soil away with her hands. The object was round, about 3 inches across, with a hinged lid. Her hands were shaking as she opened it. Inside was a compass, old style, with a brass housing and a needle that still swung true despite decades in the ground. The face was scratched but readable, and on the back, engraved in letters she would have recognized anywhere, were the initials E.M. Emmett Mearcy. The world seemed to tilt. Aura sat back on her heels, the compass cradled in her palm, and felt 30 years of questions crystallize into one terrible, wonderful certainty. Emmett had been here, not just in her imagination, not just in the dream he'd sketched on paper. He'd been to this exact spot. He'd surveyed this land. He'd started this project. The compass had been his favorite tool. Her husband had given it to him when Emmett was 15 and starting to show interest in construction and surveying. He'd carried it everywhere, using it to navigate the forest, to map trails, to orient his sketches. Finding it here, buried at the foundation point of his dream cabin, meant he'd been working on this. Actually working on it. Aura's eyes blurred with tears. All these years, she'd thought he'd just left, run away from responsibility or family or life itself. But this proved something different. He'd come here with purpose. He'd been building something. The question that had haunted her for 3 decades shifted slightly. Not why did he leave, but what happened to him here. She sat in the pine needles for a long time, turning the compass over in her hands. The needle still worked, still pointed north with unwavering certainty. It had been waiting here all this time, buried in the earth like a message, like a sign. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff and her knees protested, but she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Validation, proof. Her son hadn't been running from something, he'd been running toward something. This cabin, this dream, this place. She looked at the 3 massive pines with new eyes. Emmett had chosen them. He'd stood where she was standing now, had measured and planned and imagined. The blueprint wasn't just a teenage fantasy. It was a working document, a plan he'd been actively pursuing. The sky had clouded over while she sat, and by noon, the first drops of rain began to fall. Aura had learned to read mountain weather, and this looked like it would be more than a passing shower. She secured her tools and supplies, double-checked her tent stakes, and prepared for a storm. It arrived with the kind of fury that only mountain storms can muster. Rain fell in sheets, driven by wind that bent the smaller trees and set the pines swaying. Thunder rolled through the valleys, and lightning flickered in the distance. Aura huddled in her tent, listening to the deluge, the compass still clutched in her hand. The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening. Water pooled around her tent, despite the drainage trenches she'd dug. The temperature dropped, and she pulled on extra layers, grateful for the warm clothes she'd packed. The forest was a different place in weather like. This wild and primal and indifferent to human comfort. But Aura wasn't afraid. She'd weathered worse storms in her 72 years. And now, with Emmett's compass as proof that he'd been here, that he'd started this dream. She felt more determined than ever. When the rain finally eased near midnight, she lay in her sleeping bag, listening to water drip from the pine branches. The compass rested on her chest, its weight small but significant. She thought about Emmett at 23, young and strong, coming to this forest alone to build something extraordinary. She thought about him surveying the land, marking foundation points, planning every detail. And she thought about what might have stopped him. The forest was beautiful, but unforgiving. Weather could turn deadly without warning. A fall, an injury, an illness, any of those could prove fatal for someone alone in the wilderness. The search parties had looked, but the forest was vast, and Emmett could have been anywhere, or he could have been here, right here, in this grove, working on his dream. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. If he'd been injured here, if he'd needed help, but no. She couldn't let her mind go down that path. Not yet, not without more evidence. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening. Aura emerged from her tent to find that her worksite had survived intact. The test holes were full of water, and the ground was soft, but nothing had been destroyed. The 3 pines stood as solid as ever, their bark darkened by rain, their branches dripping diamonds in the early light. She made coffee and stood in the center of the grove, the compass in her pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. Emmett had been here. He'd worked on this. And now she would finish what he'd started. She spent that morning doing what she should have done before searching the immediate area more carefully. If Emmett had been here, and with surveying equipment, there might be other signs, markers, tools, anything that would tell her more about what he'd been doing. She found them within an hour, small cairns of stones at 3 other points around the grove, marking what she realized were the corners of a larger perimeter. Emmett hadn't just been planning the cabin, he'd been surveying the entire site, possibly planning out buildings or gardens or pathways. At the base of one cairn, she found another artifact, a small notebook, its cover weathered and water-stained but still intact. The pages were damaged, but Emmett's handwriting was visible on many of them. Notes about soil composition, sketches of plants he'd identified, observations about wildlife. And on the last legible page, dated 2 days before he disappeared, a single line, "Foundation points marked. Ready to begin tomorrow. This is going to be perfect." Aura read that line 3 times, her throat tight with emotion. Ready to begin tomorrow. But tomorrow had never come. Not for Emmett. She looked around the grove with new understanding. He'd been on the verge of starting construction. He'd surveyed, planned, marked everything out, and then something had stopped him. She folded the notebook carefully and placed it in her pack with the compass. These weren't just artifacts anymore. They were evidence of her son's last days, his final project, his unfulfilled dream. The forest seemed different now. Not just a peaceful wilderness, but a place that held secrets, a place that had taken her son and kept him for 30 years. Aura touched the bark of the nearest pine, feeling its rough texture under her palm. The tree had been here when Emmett was here. It had witnessed whatever had happened. But trees didn't speak, and the forest kept its secrets well. She thought about the search parties, how they'd looked for weeks without finding anything. If Emmett had been here, in this specific grove, they'd missed it. The forest was too vast, the vegetation too thick, and they'd had no reason to search so far from the main trails. But Aura knew now. She knew he'd been here. She knew what he'd been trying to build. And standing in the grove with his compass in her pocket and his notebook in her pack, she made a new promise. She would build the cabin, not just to honor his dream, but to mark the place where he'd last worked, last hoped, last planned for a future he'd never see. This grove would become what he'd envisioned, a structure that would last, that would speak to everyone who saw it about dreams and determination and the son she'd lost. The rain had left the air clean and fresh, Aura took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and picked up her tools. She had work to do, work that was 30 years overdue. Aura fell into a rhythm that felt older than memory. Wake with the dawn, make coffee over the camp stove, eat a simple breakfast, check the weather, assess the day's work, and begin. The forest became her. Clock and calendar. Morning was marked by birdsong, afternoon by the angle of light through the pines, evening by the cooling air and lengthening shadows. The platform foundation came first. She worked methodically, following Emmett's blueprint, but adapting it where her own experience suggested improvements. The support posts went into the ground at precise intervals, each one sunk deep and packed with gravel for drainage. She'd learned this kind of work helping her husband build the barn 40 years ago, and her muscles remembered even if they complained more than they used to. The physical labor was hard, but satisfying. Each post that went in straight and true felt like a small victory. Each measurement that matched Emmett's specifications felt like a connection across time, a conversation between mother and son conducted through wood and nails and careful planning. She worked from dawn until her body demanded rest, usually around mid-afternoon. Then she'd sit in the grove, drinking water and eating lunch, watching the forest move around her. The trees swayed in winds she couldn't feel at ground level. Birds moved through the branches, thrushes and jays and woodpeckers. Squirrels chattered and scurried, initially suspicious of her presence, but gradually accepting her as part of the landscape. One particularly bold fox began visiting her campsite in the evenings. It would sit at the edge of the clearing, watching her with intelligent eyes, and Aura would talk to it while she cooked her dinner over the fire. She told it about Emmett, about the cabin she was building, about the family that thought she was foolish. The fox never answered, but it kept coming back, and that felt like approval enough. The work progressed slowly but steadily. After the support posts came the main beams, heavy lumber she'd had to haul in sections from her base camp near the trailhead. It took 3 trips to get all the materials she needed, each trip a day's hike out and back. The physical exertion should have exhausted her, but instead she felt stronger, more alive. Her body was remembering what it could do when given a purpose. Installing the main platform beams required engineering and patience. The beams had to connect the 3 living pines without damaging their bark or restricting their growth. Emmett's design called for special brackets that would allow the trees to move and expand while still providing solid support. Aura had fabricated them at the hardware store in town during her preparation weeks, following his detailed sketches. The first beam went up on her 10th day in the forest. She'd rigged a simple pulley system to lift it into position, and when it finally settled into place, perfectly level between 2 of the pines, she'd felt a surge of joy so intense it brought tears to her eyes. This was real. This was happening. Emmett's dream was taking physical shape. She worked with a kind of meditative focus, talking to herself, or maybe to Emmett, or maybe to the trees themselves. It was an old habit, one she'd developed as a child, playing alone in these same woods. Her grandmother had done it too, she remembered. Talk to the forest like it was listening, like it might answer back. "We're going to need good weather for the next few days," she'd say to the pines. "I've got the cross beams to install, and they won't tolerate getting soaked." The forest seemed to cooperate. The weather held clear and mild, perfect working conditions. Aura began to wonder if she was being helped, though she wouldn't have said so aloud to anyone but the trees. On the 15th day, while installing the support brackets for the platform decking, she found something that stopped her cold. She'd been reaching into a hollow in the second pine, a natural cavity about chest height, to check for rot or weakness. Instead of soft wood, her fingers touched something hard and smooth. She pulled it out carefully and found herself holding a small, carved bird. It was beautiful work, detailed and precise. A mountain thrush, its wings slightly spread as if caught mid-flight, carved from a single piece of cedar. The wood had weathered, but the carving was still clear, still showing the skill of whoever had made it. And on the base, barely visible, were the initials E.M. and a date, April 14th, the week before Emmett had disappeared. Aura's legs went weak. She sat down heavily on the platform beams, cradling the carved bird in both hands. This was Emmett's work. She recognized his style. He'd carved small figures throughout his childhood, given them as gifts, left them around the house like small blessings. This thrush was more sophisticated than his childhood efforts, showing years of practice and refinement. But the style was unmistakable. He'd spent time here, not just surveying and planning, but actually being here, present in this place, making things. The bird was too detailed to be a quick project. He'd sat somewhere in this grove, probably multiple times, and carved it with care and attention. She thought about that her son, at 23, sitting in this very spot, working cedar into the shape of a bird. What had he been thinking? Had he been happy here? Had he felt at peace? The carving was a mountain thrush, the bird whose song had marked summer mornings throughout her childhood. Emmett had loved them too. They'd spent hours together identifying birds when he was young, learning their calls and habits. The thrush had been his favorite. He'd said its song sounded like hope. She turned the carving over in her hands, examining every detail. The feathers were individually defined. The eye was alert and bright. The posture suggested motion, life, purpose. Emmett had made this with love, had left it here in a tree hollow like a gift or a marker or a promise. The thought came suddenly. He'd been planning to come back. The bird was too precious, too carefully made to be left forever. He'd tucked it here for safekeeping, intending to return and retrieve it. Maybe he'd made it as a gift for someone, maybe for her. Aura pressed the carved bird to her chest and let herself cry. Not the desperate tears of fresh grief, but the deep, exhausted tears of someone who'd been carrying weight for too long. The bird was proof that Emmett had been alive here, creating here, dreaming here. And somehow that made the loss both more bearable and more painful. When the tears stopped, she wiped her eyes and looked around the grove with new awareness. If Emmett had hidden the bird in that tree hollow, what else might be here? What other signs had he left of his time in this place? She spent the rest of the afternoon searching carefully, examining trees and ground, looking for anything that might tell her more. She found small things, marks in the bark that might have been deliberate, a flat stone positioned like a step, a cleared area that could have been a campsite. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest Emmett had been here repeatedly, that he'd made this grove his base of operations. The sun was setting when she finally returned to her own camp. The fox was waiting at the edge of the clearing, and Aura held up the carved bird to show it. "Look what I found," she said. "He was here. My boy was really here." The fox tilted its head, amber eyes reflecting the last light, then melted back into the forest shadows. That night, Aura placed the carved bird on a small shelf in her tent, where she could see it when she woke. She added Emmett's compass and the water-damaged notebook. These artifacts were becoming a collection, a museum of her son's final project. Each one told her something about his time here, his intentions, his dreams. She thought about the family in the valley below, Gordon and Pauline and Faye, living their lives, thinking she was being foolish. They didn't know about the compass or the notebook or the carved bird. They didn't understand that she wasn't just building a cabin out of sentiment or stubbornness. She was following a trail Emmett had left 30 years ago, blazed not with markers, but with artifacts and evidence. And with every piece she found, every day she worked on the cabin, she came closer to understanding what had happened to him. The work wasn't just construction anymore. It was archaeology. It was detective work. It was the gradual, patient reconstruction of her son's final days. And Aura Mirsi, 72 years old and stronger than anyone gave her credit for, was going to see it through to the end. The platform deck went down over the next week, board by board, each one cut to fit around the living trees. Aura worked with the kind of careful attention that came from understanding that mistakes were expensive in both time and materials. She'd brought just enough lumber for the project, with minimal waste factored in. Every cut had to be precise. The work required her to climb, to balance, to reach and stretch in ways that tested her aging body. She'd fashioned a simple safety harness from climbing rope, knowing that a fall from 8 feet could be disastrous at her age. But despite the physical challenges, or perhaps because of them, she felt more capable than she had in years. The fox continued its evening visits, and Aura had taken to leaving scraps from her dinner at the edge of camp. The animal never came close enough to eat while she watched, but the food was always gone by morning. She found comfort in the routine, in the quiet companionship of a wild creature that chose to be near her. 3 weeks into the project, she was framing the cabin walls. The design called for them to be built in sections, then raised and attached to the platform. She'd laid out the first wall flat on the deck, measuring and cutting studs, when she noticed something odd about one of the 3 main pines. There was a split in the bark about 10 feet up, a natural separation that looked like it had been there for years. But something about it caught her eye, a glint of metal visible in the gap. She'd walked past this tree dozens of times, but the afternoon light was hitting it at just the right angle to make something shine. She positioned her ladder against the trunk and climbed carefully. The split was deeper than it appeared from the ground, and wedged into it was a small metal tin box, the kind that might once have held tobacco or mints. It was rusted at the edges but still intact, and when she pried it out, she could feel weight inside. Her hands shook as she climbed down and sat on the platform deck with the box in her lap. She knew, somehow, what this was, what it had to be. The lid was stuck, corroded by years of weather and moisture seeping into the split bark. She worked it carefully with her pocket knife, not wanting to force it and damage whatever might be inside. When it finally came free, she found the contents wrapped in oilcloth, an old-fashioned precaution that had protected them well. Inside the cloth was a letter. The paper was good quality, the kind used for important correspondence, and the ink had survived mostly intact. The handwriting was Emmett's, neat and careful, and it was addressed to her. "Dear Mama," it began. Aura's vision blurred immediately. She wiped her eyes and forced herself to focus, to read the words her son had written 3 decades ago. "Dear Mama, I'm writing this because I need to explain, and I'm not sure I'll have the courage to say it face to face. I've been coming to this forest for months now, working on the cabin I showed you when I was 16. Remember? You said it was a beautiful dream, and I could tell you meant it even though Dad thought I was wasting time. I've felt like a disappointment for so long. Gordon knows what he wants, has his life planned out. Pauline never hesitates, never questions. But me? I've been restless and lost, trying to figure out where I fit. Dad thinks I'm lazy. He doesn't say it, but I can see it in his eyes when I talk about anything besides practical work and steady paychecks. But this cabin, Mama, this is something true, something real. I've been studying the old stories you told me about our family settling in these woods generations back. I've been researching, trying to find where they actually built their homestead. I think I'm close. I think this grove might be part of it, or near it. I've found evidence survey markers, old foundations, things that suggest people lived deep in this forest long ago. Our people, maybe, our family. And if that's true, if I can prove it, then building this cabin isn't just a dream. It's reclaiming something we lost. It's showing everyone that I'm not just a restless kid with his head in the clouds. I need to prove this to myself first, though. I need to know I can do it, find the old homestead, build the cabin, make something lasting. Then I'll come home and show everyone. Show Dad, especially. Maybe then he'll understand that I'm not wasting my life. I'm just trying to build it different than he did. I'm planning to spend the next week finishing my research, marking out the full site. Then I'll come home and get what I need for real construction. I'm not abandoning the family, Mama. I'm finding our route so I can finally feel like I have a place to stand. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong and I didn't make it back like I planned. I hope that's not the case. I hope I walked out of this forest and gave this letter to you in person, and we laughed about how worried I was for nothing. But if not, if I'm gone and you find this, please know I wasn't running away. I was running toward something, toward understanding, toward belonging, toward proving that your youngest son wasn't as lost as everyone thought. I love you, Mama. I'll see you soon. Emmett. The letter was dated April 16th, 2 days before Emmett disappeared. Aura sat on the platform deck holding the letter, reading it again and again, tears running down her face unchecked. All these years, she'd wondered why he'd left, why he'd never said anything, why he'd seemingly abandoned them without explanation. And here it was. The answer she'd been carrying in her heart all along, now confirmed in his own handwriting. He hadn't been running away. He'd been trying to find himself. Trying to prove himself to a father who'd never quite approved. Trying to carve out an identity that fit who he was, instead of who everyone wanted him to be. She thought about her husband, gone 10 years now. He'd been a good man, but a hard one, a practical man who'd measured worth in visible productivity and steady income. He'd never understood Emmett's creativity, his need to explore and question and dream, and Emmett had felt that disapproval like a weight had carried it until he'd needed to escape into the forest to prove he was more than a disappointment. The tragedy of it broke her heart all over again. If only Emmett had known he didn't need to prove anything. If only her husband had lived long enough to see, but no. That path led only to regret and useless what-ifs. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the tin box, then held the box against her chest, like she'd once held her son when he was small and frightened by thunderstorms. He'd been here, searching for their family's roots, trying to build something that would prove his worth. And something had stopped him. The letter mentioned spending another week doing research, finding the old homestead. But he'd never come back. Whatever he'd found, or whatever had happened during that final week, had ended his search permanently. Aura looked around the grove with burning eyes. The 3 pines stood solid and ancient, witnesses to whatever had occurred. The platform deck was half finished beneath her, the cabin walls ready to be assembled, and somewhere out there, deeper in the forest, if Emmett's letter was accurate, were the ruins of an old homestead that might hold more answers. That evening, dark clouds rolled in again. The weather in the mountains was fickle. Days of sunshine could give way to sudden storms that transformed the forest into something primal and dangerous. Aura secured her worksite, tied down the lumber stacks, and retreated to her tent as the first drops began to fall. This storm was fiercer than the last. Rain hammered the tent fabric, driven by wind that howled through the pines. Thunder cracked and rolled, and lightning turned the forest into a strobe of stark shadows and bright flashes. The temperature plummeted, and Aura huddled in her sleeping bag, the tin box with Emmett's letter clutched in her hands. She thought about her son out here alone 30 years ago, perhaps caught in a storm like this. He'd been young and strong, but the mountains didn't care about youth or strength. Weather could kill quickly: hypothermia, lightning strikes, flash floods in the creek beds. Any of those could have taken him. The storm raged through the night, and Aura didn't sleep. She lay listening to the wind tear at the forest, feeling small and vulnerable, and achingly aware of how dangerous this place could be. By morning, she understood in her bones what might have happened to Emmett. Not the specifics, but the general truth. The forest was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and it took what it wanted without negotiation. When dawn finally came, grey and dripping, the storm had passed. Aura emerged from her tent to find tree branches down and the forest floor littered with pine needles and debris. But her worksite had held. The platform was intact, the lumber still secured. The 3 pines stood unbowed, their roots sunk deep enough to weather any storm. She made coffee with shaking hands, still cold from the long night. The carved bird and the compass were on their shelf in her tent, and now the tin box with Emmett's letter joined them. These artifacts were becoming sacred objects, physical evidence of her son's last days and final purpose. She thought about the letter's mention of an old homestead, of family history buried in the forest. If Emmett had found it, if he'd left any indication of where it was, that might explain everything. It might tell her what happened in those final days between writing the letter and disappearing forever. Ora finished her coffee and looked at the half-built cabin. The walls still needed to be raised. The roof needed to be framed. There were weeks of work ahead of her, but now that work carried new meaning. She wasn't just building Emmett's dream, she was following his trail, retracing the steps he'd taken in search of their family's past. And if that trail led her to answers, to understanding, to the truth of what had happened to her son, then every nail she drove and every board she cut brought her closer to the peace she'd been seeking for 30 years. The forest was quiet in the storm's aftermath. Water dripped from branches, and somewhere a thrush began to sing Emmett's favorite bird, its song like hope rising from the drenched earth. Ora listened, let the sound fill her chest, and picked up her tools. There was work to do, and a son's memory to honor, and a mystery that maybe, finally, could be solved. 6 weeks into the project, the cabin had taken undeniable shape. The platform deck was complete, solid enough to support the walls. The wall frames stood upright, connected and squared, creating the outline of rooms and spaces that would become living areas. The structure rose between the 3 pines like something that had always meant to be there, organic and intentional at once. Ora's body had adapted to the work. The first weeks had left her sore and exhausted, but now she moved with practiced efficiency. Her hands had developed new calluses, her muscles had remembered strength they hadn't needed in years. She'd lost weight, but gained endurance, and she slept better in her tent than she ever had in her farmhouse bed. The roof framing was her current focus. She'd designed a system of trusses that would rest on the wall frames while allowing the living trees to continue growing through planned openings. It was delicate work, requiring precision measurements and careful angles. She worked slowly, checking each calculation twice, knowing that errors at this stage would compound into bigger problems later. She was gathering pine boughs to use as temporary roofing material. She'd install proper shingles later, but for now, she needed weather protection when she found the locket. It was hanging from a low branch, about 20 yards from the cabin site, at eye level, impossible to miss once you were looking in that direction. But Ora had walked past this area dozens of times without noticing it. The metal had tarnished to a dull brown that blended with the bark, and only the particular angle of morning light had made it visible. She lifted it carefully from the branch. It was a woman's locket, heart-shaped, with a delicate chain that broke as soon as she touched it. The metal had weakened over decades of exposure. The locket opened with gentle pressure, and inside were 2 photographs, small and faded but still clear enough to identify. One was Emmett as a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. The other was Ora herself, much younger, laughing at something outside the frame. Ora's breath caught. This was Emmett's locket. She'd given it to him on his 16th birthday, not knowing if a teenage boy would appreciate such a gift. But he'd worn it, had apparently treasured it enough to keep their photos inside, and had brought it here with him 30 years ago. The placement was deliberate. The branch was at the perfect height to be seen, positioned along what would have been the path from the main trail to the cabin site. Emmett had hung it there intentionally, a marker, maybe, or a message. A way of saying, this is important, this is where I'm working, this is what I'm building for the people I love. She was holding the locket, studying the photographs and fighting back tears, when a voice called from the trees. "Grandma!" Ora turned to see Faye, picking her way through the undergrowth, a backpack on her shoulders and an expression of mingled concern and wonder on her face. Her granddaughter was 28, with Pauline's sharp features softened by youth and what Ora hoped was a kinder disposition. "Faye." Aura tucked the locket into her pocket and wiped her eyes quickly. "What are you doing out here?" "Looking for you." Faye stopped at the edge of the grove, and her eyes went wide. "Oh my God, Grandma, this is you actually built." "Not finished yet," Aura said, but she couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "Got maybe another month of work before it's truly done." Faye walked slowly around the structure, touching the wall frames, examining how they incorporated the living trees, peering up at the roof trusses. "This is incredible. I mean, I knew you said you were building a cabin, but I thought—" She stopped, embarrassed. "You thought I was being foolish," Aura finished gently. "Like your mother said, Mom's worried. So is Uncle Gordon. They sent me to check on you, make sure you were okay." Faye looked at her grandmother with careful eyes. "Are you okay? I mean, you look different." "I'm better than I've been in years," Aura said honestly. "Come on, let me show you what I'm working on." For the next hour, she walked Faye through the cabin, explaining the design, showing her Emmett's blueprint, demonstrating how the structure would allow the trees to continue growing. Faye listened intently, asking intelligent questions, her initial skepticism transforming into genuine fascination. They sat on the platform deck, legs dangling over the edge, sharing the lunch Faye had brought from town: fresh bread, cheese, apples, real food that Aura hadn't tasted in weeks. It was only then that Faye asked the question Aura had been expecting. "Why did you really come out here, Grandma? I mean, I understand wanting to build Uncle Emmett's cabin, but why now, after all this time?" Aura pulled the compass from her pocket and handed it to Faye. "I found this in the ground, right there." She pointed to the foundation hole. "Your uncle was here. He surveyed this land, marked these trees, started planning this cabin for real. He wasn't just dreaming, he was doing." Faye turned the compass over, seeing the initials. Her eyes went wide. "This is you found this here? And this," Aura showed her the carved bird, "and this, the water-damaged notebook, and this." Finally, the tin box with the letter. She let Faye read the letter, watching her granddaughter's face shift from curiosity to sadness, to something deeper, understanding maybe, or connection to an uncle she'd never known. When Faye finished, she was crying. "I never knew him," she said quietly. "I was born 2 years after he disappeared, but Mom doesn't talk about him. Uncle Gordon barely mentions him. It's like he's been erased." "Not erased," Aura said. "Just too painful to remember. Your mother was angry that he left. Gordon felt guilty, that they'd argued, and her voice caught. "I didn't know what to feel until I found these things. Until I understood he wasn't leaving, he was searching." Faye wiped her eyes and looked around the grove with new awareness. "For the old homestead, the one in your grandmother's stories. He thought finding it would prove something. That he wasn't just a dreamer, he was someone who could discover real history, reclaim real heritage." Aura's throat was tight. "He wanted to make us proud." "He would have," Faye said softly. "If he'd known, he didn't have to prove anything." They sat in silence for a while, the forest moving around them. Then Faye said, "Can I help with the cabin? I have the weekend. I could stay. Help with whatever you're working on." Aura felt something loosen in her chest, the first crack in the family's wall of disapproval and worry. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They worked together through the afternoon, Faye following Aura's instructions with surprising competence. She was handy with tools, comfortable with physical labor, and she listened carefully to Aura's explanations about technique and safety. More than that, she was curious, asking about Emmett, about the forest, about Aura's plans for the cabin once it was complete. "Will you live here?" Faye asked as they secured roof trusses. "Summers maybe," Aura said. "Winters down in the valley, but I want the family to use it. Anyone who needs a place to think, to be quiet, to remember what's important." "A memorial," Faye said. "A living memorial. Not just for Emmett, for all of us. For where we came from, who we were before we forgot." Aura straightened, her back aching but her heart light. Your uncle understood that we'd lost something, our connection to this land, to our history. He was trying to find it again. By the time the sun set, they'd made real progress. The roof framing was nearly complete, and Faye had proven herself a capable helper. They made dinner together over Aura's camp, fire-canned stew augmented with Faye's fresh vegetables, and talked until the fire burned low. Faye asked questions about Emmett's childhood, and Aura found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years. Funny stories, warm stories, memories of a boy who'd been sensitive and creative and just different enough to never quite fit the mold his father wanted for him. "Mum should hear these stories," Faye said. "She's forgotten what he was really like. Or maybe she never let herself see it." "Your mother was always practical," Aura said carefully. "Like her father. They didn't understand dreaming. They saw it as a weakness." "But it's not," Faye said fiercely. "Uncle Emmett wasn't weak. He was brave, coming out here alone, trying to find something everyone else had forgotten. That's courage." Aura felt tears prick her eyes again. But these were different tears, tears of gratitude that someone in the family finally understood, finally saw Emmett the way he deserved to be seen. That night, Faye slept in her tent nearby, and Aura lay awake listening to the forest sounds, feeling less alone than she had since arriving. The locket was on the shelf with the other artifacts, and somehow its presence completed the collection. Emmett had marked this place with his tools, his art, his words, and his love. And now, his family was beginning to find their way back to him. The fox appeared at the edge of camp just before Aura fell asleep, and she could have sworn it nodded at her, as if approving of the day's developments. She smiled in the darkness and closed her eyes, dreaming of trees that grew through roofs and families that found their way home. Faye returned the following weekend, and the weekend after that. Each visit brought supplies, news from town, and so many questions about Emmett, about the forest, about what Aura was hoping to find. Pauline didn't approve of these visits, Faye admitted, but she wasn't forbidding them either. That was progress. Of a kind, on Faye's third visit, they made a discovery that changed everything. Aura had built a simple fire ring near her tent, a circle of stones for cooking and warmth. Over the weeks, the ring had settled into the ground, becoming a permanent feature. On a particularly cool morning, while cleaning out old ash to prepare for a new fire, Aura's hand struck something solid beneath one of the larger stones. She moved the stone and found a piece of birch bark, folded and protected by its position under the rock. When she unfolded it carefully, she found a map. It was hand-drawn, detailed, and unmistakably Emmett's work. The cabin site was marked at the center, and radiating out from it were a series of X marks at various locations throughout the surrounding forest. Each mark had a notation beside it: stone marker, old foundation, carved initial, survey stake. Emmett had been systematically searching the area, documenting what he found, mapping the evidence of old settlement. And this map suggested he'd found quite a bit. "He was right," Aura whispered, tracing the marks with one finger. "The old homestead is out here somewhere. He was finding it piece by piece." Faye leaned over her shoulder, studying the map. "Some of these marks aren't far. We could reach this one." She pointed to an X about half a mile northeast, in maybe 20 minutes. Aura looked at her granddaughter and saw the same spark of curiosity that had driven Emmett. "Let's go," she said. They packed water and basic supplies, then set out following Emmett's map. The forest was thick with undergrowth, but deer trails provided natural pathways, and Aura's lifetime of woods experience helped them navigate. The coordinates weren't precise. The map was a sketch, not a surveyor's document, but the landmarks were clear enough. They found the first site exactly where the map indicated. It was a small clearing, barely visible under 30 years of forest growth, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. A ring of firestones sat at the center, similar to Aura's but older, more settled into the earth. Nearby, signs of a temporary shelter, 4 saplings, bent and tied in a way that could have supported a tarp or canvas roof. He camped here, Faye said, walking the perimeter. This was one of his base camps. Aura knelt by the fire ring, running her hands over the stones. They were cold, dead for decades, but they'd once held Emmett's warmth. He'd sat here in the evenings, probably studying his findings, making plans, dreaming of what he'd discover next. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by ferns, they found a second tin box. This one was in worse condition than the first, and when Aura opened it, she found journal pages, more of Emmett's notes, water-damaged but partially legible. The pages documented his search systematically, measurements, descriptions of landmarks, theories about where the old homestead might be located. One entry stood out, found what might be boundary markers, 3 stones in a line, equally spaced, about 200 yards north of main camp. Stones showed tool marks, definitely placed deliberately. Tomorrow I'll follow the line and see where it leads. I think I'm getting close to the main site. I can feel it. The date was April 18th, the day Emmett had disappeared. Aura and Faye looked at each other, the implications clear. Whatever Emmett had found, following those boundary markers, might have been the last thing he'd discovered. And this camp suggested he'd been planning to return here afterward. They explored the site more thoroughly, finding small artifacts, a broken pencil, a weathered tarp tied in a tree that had partially grown around it, Emmett's initials carved in a birch trunk, evidence of a young man working methodically toward a goal, leaving traces of himself in the forest like breadcrumbs. "We need to check the other marks," Faye said, studying the map. If he documented his search this thoroughly, there might be more journals, more clues about what he found. They returned to the cabin site to gather more supplies, planning to make a systematic search of all the marked locations. But when they emerged into the grove, they found they had a visitor. Gordon stood on the platform deck, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his khaki pants and button-down shirt. Aura's son was 52, solid and graying, with the kind of face that always looked worried. Right now he looked more worried than usual. "Gordon," Aura said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing, Mom." But his tone wasn't angry. It was something else, something that looked almost like guilt. "Faye told me what you've been finding. The compass, the letters." He took a breath. "I need to talk to you." About Emmett, about the day he disappeared. They sat on the platform deck, the 3 of them, with the afternoon sun filtering through the pine branches. Gordon looked like a man preparing for confession. "I've been going through old papers," he said slowly, "at the farmhouse, in the attic, stuff that's been up there since Dad died, that none of us wanted to deal with." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "And I found something that changes everything we thought we knew." He handed the document to Aura. It was old, yellowed with age, covered in formal language and official seals. A deed, dated 1847, granting land rights to William Mearcy Aura's great-great-grandfather for a parcel in the northern forest. "This land," Gordon said, gesturing around them, "this exact location, it's ours. It's been ours for over 170 years. The property lines got confused when the county did new surveys in the 1922, and somehow our claim got lost in the paperwork. But legally, officially, this forest section belongs to the Mearcy family." Aura stared at the deed, her hands shaking. The description matched the landmarks, the creek references, the boundaries. This grove, this cabin site, was standing on land that had belonged to her ancestors. "Emmett knew," Gordon continued, his voice tight. "He came to me about a year before he disappeared, asked me about family land records, about old deeds, said he was researching our history." Gordon's face crumpled. "And I told him he was wasting his time. I told him to stop chasing fairy tales and focus on real life. I dismissed him, Mom." I made him feel like his search was stupid. Tears ran down Gordon's face, and Aura saw her strong, steady son break open with 30 years of guilt. The last real conversation I had with him was an argument, Gordon said. He wanted to talk about family heritage, about reclaiming something we'd lost. And I told him to grow up. I told him to stop being such a... His voice broke. I called him a dreamer, like it was an insult. And then he was gone, and I never got to take it back. Aura reached over and took her son's hand. He wasn't running from you, Gordon, or from any of us. He was running toward something. Toward this. She gestured at the deed, the cabin, the forest around them. He was trying to prove he wasn't just a dreamer. He was trying to show us all that he could find something real, something important. But I should have supported him, Gordon said. I should have believed in him. Instead, I made him feel like he had to prove himself, like he wasn't enough just as he was. Faye had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke up. Uncle Gordon, he didn't die because of anything you said. He died because the forest is dangerous, because he was alone, because something happened that nobody could have prevented. We don't know that, Gordon said. We don't know what happened to him. We don't even know if... He stopped, unable to finish. We will know, Aura said firmly. She showed him the birch bark map, explained about the boundary markers, the camp they'd found. The journal entry dated the day of his disappearance. Emmett left us a trail. He documented everything. If we follow it, we'll find out what happened. We'll finally know. Gordon looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at the cabin, really seeing it for the first time. You built this, he said to his mother. At 72 years old, you came out here alone and built this. I had help, Aura said, nodding at Faye. And I had Emmett's blueprint. And I had a promise to keep. The family mocked you, Gordon said quietly. I didn't stop them. I let Pauline call you foolish. I was embarrassed by what you were doing. I know, Aura said. I was wrong. Gordon stood and walked to the edge of the platform, looking out at the forest. You weren't being foolish. You were doing what Emmett couldn't, finishing what he started, and you found proof that he was right all along, about everything. He turned back to face them, and Aura saw something in her son's face that she hadn't seen in decades, determination mixed with hope. I want to help, Gordon said. I want to search those marked locations. I want to find out what happened to my brother, and I want to... His voice caught. I want to finish what he started. With you, as a family. Aura stood and walked to her son, and Gordon wrapped his arms around her in the first real embrace they'd shared since his father's funeral. He was taller than her now, broader, older, but in that moment he felt like her little boy again. The one who'd been serious and responsible even as a child, who'd always tried to do the right thing, even when it hurt. We'll find him, Aura whispered. We'll find out what happened, and we'll finish the cabin, together. When they broke apart, Faye was crying, and the three of them stood on the platform, surrounded by living trees and growing things, the first real reunion the family had managed in 30 years. Gordon stayed. He made a call to his office, rearranged his schedule, and set up his own tent near Aura's. Pauline arrived 3 days later, not because she'd softened, but because Gordon had called her and said, in a tone that allowed no argument, "You need to see this." Pauline was 54, dressed inappropriately for the forest in clean jeans and a white blouse, her face tight with the kind of disapproval that had become her default expression. She climbed into the grove, looking like she'd been summoned to an intervention, prepared to be the voice of reason among people who'd lost their minds. Then she saw the cabin. The word was all she said. The word was all she said. The word, small and surprised. Aura watched her daughter circle the structure, touching the walls, examining how the trees grew through the design. Seeing what couldn't be denied, this was real work, solid work, the kind of building that would last generations. Pauline had inherited her father's practicality, his eye for quality construction. And however much she'd wanted to dismiss this project as foolishness, the cabin itself made its own argument. "You built this," Pauline said finally, looking at Aura with an expression that might have been respect. "By yourself." "Faye's been helping," Aura said. "And Gordon, these last few days." Pauline looked at her brother, who'd been watching from the platform. "Gordon said there were things I needed to see. Documents. Evidence about—" She stopped, unable to say Emmett's name without her face tightening. "About your brother," Aura finished gently. "Yes. Come sit down. We'll show you everything." They gathered on the platform, the four of us soon. With them 3 generations of Mersey women and 1 guilt-haunted man, and Aura laid out the artifacts like evidence at a trial. The compass, the carved bird, the journal pages, the letter from the tin box, and finally, the deed Gordon had found. Pauline read the letter twice, her face unreadable. When she finished, she sat very still, staring at nothing. The afternoon light made patterns on the platform deck, and somewhere a thrush sang Emmett's favorite bird. "He didn't leave," Pauline said finally, her voice strange and hollow. "All this time, I thought he'd just abandoned us. Decided we weren't worth staying for, and he was here, trying to—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "Trying to prove himself." "He didn't need to prove anything," Aura said, "but he thought he did. Your father was hard on him." "We all were, in our ways. I told him he was selfish," Pauline said, still staring at nothing. "The last time I saw him, he'd missed Sunday dinner because he was working on something. And I told him he was selfish and immature, and that Mama and Dad deserved better." She looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "Those were the last words I said to my brother. And for 30 years, I've believed I was right to say them." "Pauline," Gordon said quietly, "don't." She held up a hand. I need to say this." She turned to Aura. "I was angry at you for coming out here. I thought you were being foolish, chasing a dead man's ghost. I said terrible things at that Sunday dinner. I made fun of you." "I know," Aura said. "But you were right. You've been right this whole time." Pauline gestured at the cabin, the artifacts, the forest around them. "Emmett was here. He was working on something real, and you found him. Or at least, you found the truth about him." She wiped her eyes roughly. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." It was the first time Pauline had apologized to Aura in decades. The words seemed to cost her something, scraping past pride and stubbornness, but they were sincere. "We're going to search the rest of the marked locations," Gordon said, showing Pauline the birchbark map. "Emmett left a trail. If we follow it, we'll find out what happened to him." Pauline studied the map, and some of her old sharpness returned. "Then let's not waste time. How many sites are left to check?" Over the next week, the family worked together in a way they hadn't since before Emmett's disappearance. They took turns on the cabin construction and on exploring the marked locations. Pauline turned out to be surprisingly capable in the forest. She'd grown up here too, had spent her childhood roaming the same trails Aura remembered. She'd just forgotten, or chosen to forget, how much she'd once loved these woods. They found evidence at each marked site. More camp locations, more fire rings, carved initials, stone markers. Emmett had been thorough, had spent months, maybe longer, systematically searching the forest for traces of the old homestead. And gradually, a pattern emerged. The sites radiated out from the cabin location in a rough circle, then began to concentrate toward the northeast. The last 3 marks on the map were all in that direction, and according to Emmett's journal entries, that's where he'd found the most promising evidence. "The boundary markers he mentioned in the last entry," Gordon said, studying the map. "They should be near this location." He pointed to a mark about a mile from the cabin. They set out together, all four of them, on a morning that was clear and perfect. The forest was at its best, green and alive, full of birdsong and dappled light. Aura walked with her children and granddaughter, following a trail her son had blazed 30 years ago, and felt something like hope rising in her chest. The boundary markers were exactly where Emmett's notes suggested, 3 large stones set in a deliberate line, each showing signs of tool work, chisel marks from the 1800s when such work was done by hand. They were partially overgrown but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. He found them, Faye breathed. This is what he wrote about in the last entry. They followed the line of stones, and after about 200 yards, the forest opened into a larger clearing. And there, covered in moss and decades of forest growth, were the unmistakable remains of stone foundations. The structures had been substantial. You could see the outlines of what must have been a main house, a barn, possibly other outbuildings. The stones were old, hand-fitted, the kind of careful work done by people who intended to stay, to build something lasting. And at the entrance to what had been the main house, a cornerstone bore a date and a name, carved deep into the rock. Merci 1847, Pauline gasped. Gordon went to his knees beside the stone, tracing the letters with shaking fingers. Faye pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, documenting everything. Aura just stood there, feeling the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders. This was it, the homestead her grandmother had told stories about, the place their family had built and lost and forgotten. The history Emmett had been searching for, he'd found it. On the day he'd disappeared, he'd followed the boundary markers and discovered this place, proved his theories correct, validated his search. And then what? What had happened next? They explored the ruins carefully, finding more artifacts, old tools rusted beyond use, glass bottles turned purple by age and sun, pieces of pottery and metal that had once been parts of daily life. And in what had been the main house, tucked under what remained of a collapsed wall, they found a backpack. It was modern, or had been 30 years ago. Weathered and faded now, with the fabric partially rotted, but still recognizably a pack that someone had carried recently relative to the 1,847 structures, at least. Aura knew what it was before Gordon opened it. She could feel it in her bones, in her heart, in the 30 years of wondering and waiting. The pack was Emmett's. Inside, they found his wallet, his driver's license photo showing a young man with a hopeful smile. A second journal, this one documenting his most recent findings. A camera with film that would probably never develop properly after so long. And tucked in a side pocket, wrapped in plastic to protect it, a final letter. This one wasn't addressed to Aura. It was addressed to my family. Gordon opened it with shaking hands and read aloud, "If you're reading this, I found it. I found the original Merci homestead, exactly where I thought it would be. I have photos, measurements, documentation. I found the cornerstone with our name. I found proof that our family built something real in this forest, that we have roots here that go back generations. Tomorrow, I'm going back to town. I'm going to show everyone what I've discovered. I'm going to file the deed, Mom, kept in the old Bible. Yes, I found that too, tucked in the attic. Evidence that this land is legally ours. I'm going to reclaim our heritage and prove that sometimes dreams are just the beginning of real work. I'm also going to apologize to Gordon for arguing about practical stuff when he was just trying to help me succeed, to Pauline for missing so many family dinners, to Dad for not being the son he wanted me to be, and to Mama for making her worry. But most of all, I'm going to show them all that I wasn't just wandering, I was searching, and I found what I was looking for. The cabin will come next. I've got the site picked out, the plans drawn, the whole thing ready to go. It'll be beautiful, a place where our family can gather, where we can remember who we were before we forgot. A place between earth and sky, just like I always dreamed. I'm so close now, I can feel everything coming together. Tomorrow, I'll walk out of this forest with proof that the restless kid everyone worried about was actually finding his way home. I'll see you all soon, Emmett. The date was April 18th, 30 years ago. The letter explained everything and nothing. Emmett had found what he was searching for, had been planning to return home the next day. Something had stopped him between writing this letter and making that hike out. They looked at each other, the family reunited by grief and discovery, standing in the ruins of their ancestral home. And Aura knew, with terrible certainty, that Emmett was still here somewhere, close. He'd never made it home because something had happened between this homestead and the trailhead. "We need to search," she said quietly. "The area around these ruins. If he was planning to leave the next day, but didn't make it, she didn't finish. She didn't have to." They all understood. The forest had taken her son, and now, finally, they would find where it kept him. They contacted the authorities that afternoon, hiking back to where Gordon's truck was parked and using his cell phone to call the sheriff's department. The sheriff himself drove out the next morning, a different man than had led the search 30 years ago, but he knew the story. Everyone in the valley knew about Emmett Mearcy, the young man who'd walked into the forest and never walked out. 2 deputies came with him, along with a search and rescue coordinator and someone from the county coroner's office. They hiked to the homestead site, examined the remains and the artifacts, and listened to Aura explain what they'd found. "This changes the search parameters," the coordinator said, studying a topographic map. "If he was here on April 18th and planning to hike out the next day, he would have taken the most direct route to the trailhead. That's about 4 miles northeast through rough terrain." She traced a line on the map. "We'll organize a systematic grid search of this corridor. We want to help," Gordon said. The coordinator looked at him, at Aura, at Pauline and Faye, a family that had waited 30 years for answers. "All right," she said, "but you follow our protocols. You don't touch anything you find. You mark it and call us immediately. Understood?" They understood. The search began the next morning. More volunteers arrived, neighbors, friends, people who remembered the original search and wanted to help bring closure. They worked in lines, moving slowly through the forest, eyes on the ground, looking for anything that didn't belong. Aura walked with Pauline, the 2 of them side by side, for the first time in years, without arguing. They didn't talk much, the work required concentration, but there was a companionship in the shared purpose that felt like the beginning of repair. Gordon worked with Faye, teaching her how to read the forest the way Emmett had taught him when they were boys. "Look for disturbances," he explained, "places where the undergrowth is different, where the ground is slightly raised or sunken. 30 years is a long time, but the forest remembers." They searched for 3 days, covering every foot of the corridor between the homestead and the trailhead. They found small things, a rusty knife that might have been a camper's, an old boot that turned out to be from the 1972, rocks that looked placed, but probably weren't. Nothing definitive. Nothing that brought them closer to Emmett. On the 4th day, Aura woke before dawn with a certainty she couldn't explain. She made coffee in the dark, watching the first light filter through the pines, and thought about her son. Where would he have gone? What route would he have taken? The search coordinator had assumed the most direct path, but Emmett had been methodical. He'd marked everything, mapped everything. He wouldn't have just struck out cross-country. He would have followed landmarks, used the same paths he'd established during his months of searching. She pulled out the birchbark map and studied it by lantern light. The marked locations formed a pattern they connected, creating a route that wound through the forest more circuitously than a straight line, but followed natural trails and landmarks. A path that was longer but easier, that someone carrying equipment would choose over rough terrain. When the search team assembled that morning, Aura showed them her theory. "He wouldn't have gone straight," she said. "He'd have followed his own trail, the one he'd been using all along." The coordinator looked at the map, then at her topographic chart. "That adds another 2 miles to the route." Are you sure? No, Aura admitted, but I knew my son, and this is how he would have thought. They adjusted the search pattern. The volunteers spread out along the new route, and by mid-morning they'd found confirmation, a marker stone at a trail intersection, placed deliberately with EM scratched into its surface. Emmett had been this way. The discovery energized everyone. They moved with renewed focus, following the trail Emmett had marked, finding more signs of his passage. A cairn here, a broken branch positioned as a pointer there. He'd left breadcrumbs, and now, 30 years later, they were following him home. It was Faye who found the disturbed ground. They'd reached a section of forest where an old oak had fallen, probably decades ago, creating a small clearing. The tree had been massive, and its root ball had torn up earth when it fell, creating a depression that had gradually filled with leaf litter and soil. But something about the depression looked wrong. The vegetation was slightly different, the surface just slightly more sunken than natural decay would explain. Here, Faye called, her voice tight. I think here. The search team converged on the spot. The coordinator examined it carefully, then called for tools. They'd brought proper archaeological equipment, knowing that any remains would need to be excavated carefully, respectfully, and documented thoroughly. Aura stood back with Gordon and Pauline, the three of them holding hands like children, watching as the team began to work. The forest was quiet around them, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had stopped singing. 2 feet down, they found the first bone. The medical examiner confirmed it was human and old, consistent with 30 years of burial. They continued carefully, and gradually the skeleton emerged. A young man, lying as if he'd simply laid down and never gotten up. And on what remained of his chest, still attached to a remnant of fabric, was a silver pocket watch. Gordon made a sound like he'd been punched. Pauline turned away, her hand over her mouth. But Aura stepped forward, her legs steady despite the trembling in her chest. That's his, she said quietly. I gave it to him. His father and we gave it to him for his 18th birthday. She could see the engraving from where she stood, could remember the words they'd had inscribed, to our son, who sees what others miss. The medical examiner worked carefully, removing the watch and opening it. Inside, the front cover was a photograph, small and preserved by the watch's seal. It showed Aura, younger, smiling. Emmett had carried her picture against his heart. Aura felt something break and heal simultaneously inside her chest. Grief and relief tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. Her son was found. After 30 years, he was found. The medical examiner continued the excavation, while the family stood witness. It took hours to complete properly, to document everything, to recover all the remains with proper respect. When it was done, the examiner spoke to them gently. Based on the position and the condition of the remains, I'd say he died quickly, probably in his sleep. There's no evidence of trauma, no sign of struggle. My preliminary assessment, and will confirm this with full examination, is that he likely fell ill. The weather records from that week show temperatures drop below freezing at night. If he was fighting an infection or fever, hypothermia could have taken him very quickly. He was alone, Pauline said, her voice breaking. He was sick and alone, and he died out here with no one to help him. He was doing what he loved, Aura said softly. He found what he was searching for. He was coming home to tell us. He just didn't make it. The remains were transported carefully, reverently, down to the trailhead where a county van waited. The family followed, a slow procession through the forest that had kept their secrets for so long. The sheriff walked beside Aura, and she found herself grateful for his quiet presence. We'll need to do a full examination, he said, but everything we've found is consistent with your theory. He camped at the homestead, got sick, tried to make it out but didn't have the strength. The location where we found him, it's about halfway between the homestead and the trailhead, like he knew he was in trouble and was trying to get to help. Aura nodded, unable to speak. She thought about Emmett at 23, young and strong, and full of dreams, lying down in the forest because he couldn't walk another step. Had he been frightened? Had he known he was dying? Or had he simply been too sick to realize, slipping away without understanding? She would never know the answer to those questions, but she knew the important things now. She knew he hadn't run away. She knew he'd found what he was searching for. She knew he'd been planning to come home, to reconcile, to show them all that his dreams had substance. That night, the family gathered at Aura's farmhouse for the first time in years. They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Aura had announced her plan to build the cabin, where Pauline had mocked her and Gordon had tried to reason with her. But now the mocking and reasoning were done. Now they sat in silence, processing what they'd found, what they'd lost, and what they'd gained. "We should finish the cabin," Faye said finally. "That's what Uncle Emmett would want, to see his design built, to have the family use it." "A memorial," Pauline said. "More than that," Gordon said. "A place where we can remember who we were supposed to be. Who we were before we stopped believing in dreams." Aura reached across the table and took her children's hands. He proved everything he set out to prove. The homestead is real. The land is ours. His research was solid. Her voice caught. He just ran out of time to show us. "Then we'll show for him," Gordon said fiercely. "We'll finish the cabin. We'll file the deed officially. We'll reclaim our family's land. And we'll make sure everyone knows that Emmett Mearcy wasn't a dreamer who got lost. He was a seeker who found exactly what he was looking for." They sat together as darkness fell, 4 people bound by blood and loss, and the beginning of something that looked like forgiveness. Outside, the northern forest stood in its ancient patience, keeping new secrets while releasing old ones, holding the Mearcy family in its green embrace the way it had always done, the way it always would. The medical examiner's report arrived 2 weeks later. Gordon brought it to the forest, where the family had returned to continue work on the cabin. They'd made an unspoken agreement. They would finish together what Emmett had started, and they would finish it before they buried him. They gathered on the completed platform deck, and Gordon read the report aloud. The language was clinical, detached, but the story it told was clear enough. Emmett had died of pneumonia, complicated by severe hypothermia. The infection had likely come on rapidly. Young, healthy people sometimes got hit hardest by sudden illness. Within a day or two, he would have been feverish, disoriented, weakening quickly. The weather records confirmed that the temperatures had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of April 19th. If Emmett had been fevered and alone, trying to make it back to civilization, the cold would have been deadly. He probably didn't suffer long, the examiner had noted in a separate letter addressed to Aura. At that level of illness, combined with hypothermia, consciousness fades quickly. He would have felt tired, laid down to rest, and simply not woken up. "It's as peaceful as these things can be." Peaceful? Aura turned the word over in her mind, trying to find comfort in it. Her son had died alone in the forest, his dreams realized but not yet shared, his reconciliation planned but never completed. But he died doing what he loved, in a place that had meaning, with proof of his success, literally in his backpack. There was a kind of poetry in that, even if it was the saddest poetry she'd ever read. "We need to decide about the burial," Pauline said. She'd softened over the past weeks, her sharp edges worn down by grief and revelation. "The funeral home is waiting for our instructions. The family plot," Gordon said immediately. "Next to Dad." But Aura shook her head. "Emmett never quite fit next to his father in life. I don't think that's where he'd want to rest." She looked around the grove, at the 3 massive pines, at the cabin rising between them. "This is where he belongs. This is where his heart was." "Can we do that?" Faye asked. "I mean legally?" "The land is ours," Gordon said, pulling out the deed. "I had the county confirm it. We can do whatever we want with it, including establishing a private family cemetery if we choose." Pauline was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He'd like that, being here, where he was working, where he was happy. Her voice broke on the last word, but she pushed through. "We should have a proper service, though. Let people say goodbye. Let the town know what really happened." They planned it together, the four of them, sitting on the platform as afternoon light filtered through pine branches. A memorial service in town first, at the small church where the Mearseys had been members for generations. Then, a private family burial here, in the grove, with a stone marker that would tell the truth about Emmett's life and death. "What should it say?" Faye asked, pulling out a notebook. "On the marker?" Aura thought about her son, the boy who'd loved birds and forests, who'd drawn blueprints and carved wooden thrushes, who'd searched for his family's roots while everyone thought he was just wandering, who'd found exactly what he was looking for but hadn't lived to share it. "It should say he was a seeker," she said finally, "that he found what he was searching for, that his dreams had substance." Gordon wrote something down, crossed it out, tried again. Finally, he showed them. Emmett Mearsey, 1957 to 1980, seeker, builder, dreamer. He found what he was looking for. They all looked at it for a long time. Then Pauline, surprising everyone, added, and underneath that, his family finished what he started. It was perfect. It told the story, all of it, the search and the building and the family coming together to honor him. Aura felt tears running down her face, but for the first time in 30 years, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of completion, of closure, of promises kept. "We should add something about the cabin," Faye said, "so people understand what this place is." They discussed it and decided on a second marker, to be placed at the entrance to the grove, explaining the cabin's significance. Not just a memorial, but a living place, available to any Mearsey family member who needed refuge, solitude, or connection to their roots. The work on the cabin continued with new purpose now. Every nail Gordon drove, he drove for his brother. Every board Pauline cut, she cut with the precision Emmett would have appreciated. Faye worked on the finishing touches, the trim around windows, the hardware on the door, the small details that transformed a structure into a home. And Aura oversaw it all, checking against Emmett's blueprint, making sure the reality matched his vision. She added small touches. He would have loved a shelf for the carved bird, hooks for the compass and locket, a place of honor for his journals and letters. The cabin was becoming a shrine, yes, but also a shelter, a place that told a story while also inviting new stories to unfold. 3 weeks after finding Emmett's remains, the cabin was finished. It stood between the 3 pines exactly as the blueprint had specified, with living trees growing through its structure, with a roof that would shed rain and snow for generations, with windows positioned to catch the sunrise and sunset. It was beautiful. It was solid. It was real. And standing in the doorway, looking out at the forest her son had loved, Aura felt something she'd thought lost forever: pride. Not just in the building, though that was substantial, but pride in Emmett, in his determination and vision. Pride in her family for coming together to honor him. Pride in herself for having the courage to follow her instinct into the forest, to search for answers, to refuse to let him be forgotten. "He'd love it," Gordon said, standing beside her. "It's exactly what he drew, exactly what he dreamed." "It's what we built," Aura corrected gently. "Together." For him, they stood in silence, the family that had been broken and was slowly repairing, in the cabin that had brought them back together, in the forest that had finally given up its secrets. And somewhere a thrush began to sing, its voice like hope rising through the pines. The memorial service was held on a Saturday in late September, when the forest was just beginning to turn gold, and the air carried the first whisper of autumn. The church was packed, neighbors and friends, people who'd known Emmett as a boy, volunteers who'd helped with the original search 30 years ago, and the recent search that had finally found him. Gordon spoke first. He stood at the pulpit, his voice steady despite the tears on his face, and told the truth about his brother. About the arguments they'd had, the ways he'd dismissed Emmett's dreams, the guilt he'd carried for 30 years believing he'd driven his brother away. "But I was wrong," Gordon said to the assembled crowd. "Emmett wasn't running from anything. He was running toward something, toward understanding, toward his family's history, toward building something that would last." He held up the blueprint, now framed and preserved. "This is what my brother was trying to build. A cabin in the forest, integrated with living trees, a place where our family could gather and remember who we are. And he found where to build it on land that's been in our family since 1847, land we'd forgotten we owned. He showed photographs of the homestead ruins, of the cornerstone with the Mersey name, of the artifacts Emmett had discovered." The crowd murmured, understanding growing. This wasn't just a tragedy of a young man lost in the woods. This was a story of reclamation, of discovery, of a seeker who'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. Pauline spoke next, her voice tight but determined. "I was angry at my brother for leaving," she said. "For 30 years I was angry. I thought he'd abandoned us without explanation. I called him selfish." She paused, composing herself. "But the truth is, I was the selfish one. I wanted him to be someone he wasn't. I wanted him to fit into the box of expectations we'd built, and when he wouldn't, when he couldn't, I judged him for it." She looked directly at Aura. "My mother understood him better than any of us. She knew he was searching for something, and she trusted him enough to honor that search. While I mocked her for building his cabin, she was actually doing what all of us should have done 30 years ago, believing in him." Faye spoke last, representing a generation that had never known Emmett, but had learned to love him through his artifacts and his dreams. "My uncle died before I was born," she said, "but over the past few months I've gotten to know him, through his journals, his letters, his careful documentation of everything he found. He was methodical and passionate and brave, and he taught me something important, that dreams aren't foolish unless we let them be. That searching for meaning isn't wasted time. That sometimes the most practical thing you can do is honor what matters to you, even if other people don't understand." The service ended with a hymn Emmett had loved as a child, and then the family invited anyone who wanted to join them for the burial in the forest. Most of the town came. They drove to the trailhead and hiked in, a procession of people winding through the trees, following the path Emmett had marked and Aura had found. When they reached the grove, people gasped. The cabin stood like something out of a storybook, perfectly integrated with the massive pines, beautiful and solid and real. It was proof, physical and undeniable, that Emmett's dreams had substance. The burial site was prepared a place near the cabin, but not so close as to be disturbing to future visitors. The family had chosen well, a spot where the morning sun would reach, where the wind whispered through pine branches, where a person could rest in peace, surrounded by the forest he'd loved. The casket was simple cedar, made by a local craftsman who'd known Emmett as a boy. Inside, along with his remains, the family had placed items that mattered: his surveying compass, his first set of carving tools, copies of his journals, so he'd always have his work with him. The pocket watch would stay with Aura, a connection she needed to keep. They lowered him into the earth, while the valley's minister said words about rest and peace and eternal life. Gordon and Pauline stood on either side of Aura, supporting her, all three of them, supporting each other. Faye read the inscription they'd chosen for his marker, her young voice clear and strong. People filed past, each dropping a handful of forest earth onto the casket. Many were crying. Some were smiling through their tears. All of them understood now what Emmett Mersey had been trying to do, and what his family had finished on his behalf. When everyone else had left, when the grave had been filled and the marker placed, the family stood alone in the grove. Gordon produced a hand-carved sign he'd made in his workshop, Emmett's Place, and hung it at the cabin entrance. It was simple, direct, perfect. "Welcome home, brother," he said softly. They went inside the cabin, the four of them, and sat in the main room where light filtered through the trees, growing through the roof openings. The structure creaked gently in the wind, settling, becoming part of the forest. Outside, a thrush sang. Inside, a family that had been broken began, finally, to heal. Aura touched the wall, feeling the solid wood under her palm, and thought about the family who'd mocked her for building this. They'd been wrong. The cabin had proved them wrong. Not through words or arguments, but through its simple existence. Through the truth it represented that honoring the dead sometimes means finishing their work, that love sometimes means believing in what others can't see, that stubbornness in service of truth isn't foolishness at all. She'd built her son's dream, she'd found his body, she'd brought her family back together, and now, sitting in the cabin between living trees, with her children beside her and her granddaughter's hand in hers, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 decades. Peace. 3 months passed, and autumn turned to early winter. The northern forest prepared for sleep, the deciduous trees bare, the evergreens holding their green against the grey sky. Snow would come soon, and the cabin would wait through the cold months, solid and patient, until spring brought the family back. But before the heavy snows arrived, Aura made one last trip to the grove. She hiked alone, the way she'd first come, carrying a pack with supplies and a heart full of complicated emotions. The trail was familiar now, marked and maintained by the family's regular visits. What had once been Emmett's secret path was now the Mearcy family trail, worn by feet and love and regular use. The cabin stood exactly as they'd left it, after the burial, weathered by a season of use, but fundamentally sound, built to last generations. Gordon had installed a wood stove before the weather turned, and Aura spent her first hour there getting a fire going, warming the space, making it feel alive again. She sat in the chair Gordon had built, looking out the window at Emmett's grave marker. The stone was simple granite, engraved with the words they'd chosen. Even from inside the cabin, she could read them, and they brought both pain and comfort in equal measure. The artifacts were all here now, displayed with reverence: the compass on a shelf, the carved bird on the mantel, the letters in a protective case Gordon had commissioned. The cabin had become a living museum of Emmett's search, a place where family could come to remember and understand. Aura pulled out her old journal, the one she'd been writing to Emmett for 30 years, and read through the entries. Letters to a missing son, questions that had no answers, grief documented in careful handwriting. The journal ended the day she'd decided to build the cabin, and now she picked up her pen to write one final entry. "Dear Emmett," she wrote, "I found you. I found what you were searching for, and I found you. I built your cabin, and it's beautiful, exactly like your blueprint, exactly like your dream. Your brother and sister helped. Your niece, who you never got to meet, worked alongside us. We came together because of you, because of what you left behind, because of the trail you blazed through the forest and through our family's history. I learned so much about you these past months, not just where you went or what you found, but who you were. You were brave and methodical and visionary. You saw what the rest of us had forgotten, that we came from builders and dreamers, that we had roots worth finding, that heritage matters even when it's buried under years and neglect. I'm sorry we didn't appreciate that while you were alive. I'm sorry your father made you feel like dreaming was weakness, that Gordon argued with you about practicality, that Pauline called you selfish. You deserved better from us. You deserved to be celebrated for who you were, not criticized for who you weren't. But I hope, wherever you are, you know that we understand now. We finished what you started. We filed the deed and reclaimed our family's land. We built your cabin and made it a place where future Mearcys can come to remember their roots. We found the homestead and documented everything you discovered. Your research wasn't wasted. Your dreams had substance. You proved everything you set out to prove. The family has changed because of you. Gordon is softer now, more willing to listen to ideas that don't fit his orderly worldview. Pauline has learned that strength sometimes means admitting you were wrong, that love means honoring what you didn't understand. And Faye, your niece, who has your same curiosity and courage, she's talking about being a historian, about documenting family stories before they're lost. As for me, I learned that sometimes being a foolish old woman is exactly what's needed, that trusting your instincts matters more than listening to doubters. That 72 is not too old to build a cabin, to solve a mystery, to honor a promise made to a son's memory. The cabin stands, baby. It stands between living trees, just like you drew it. The forest grows through it, around it, with it. It'll be here for generations, telling your story, proving that dreams built with love can outlast anything. I'll come back in spring. The whole family will. This is ours, now yours and ours. A place between earth and sky, where the past and present meet, where a family remembers who they are. I love you. I always did, even when I didn't understand you. And I'm so proud of what you accomplished, what you tried to show us, what you left behind. Rest well, my boy. Your work is done, and it was good work. Real work, important work, your mama. She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf with the other artifacts. Then she stood and walked outside, into the cold November afternoon, and stood at Emmett's grave. They mocked me, she said aloud to the stone, to the grave, to her son's spirit if it was listening. Your sister called me foolish for coming out here. Your brother tried to talk me out of it. Half the town thought I'd lost my mind. She smiled, feeling the wind in her hair, the forest alive around her. But I built it anyway. I built your dream, and it proved every one of them wrong. Not because I needed to be right, but because you deserved to be honored. A thrush called from the pines, Emmett's favorite bird. Still here, even as winter approached. Aura took it as a sign, as a blessing, as her son saying he understood. She spent one more night in the cabin, warm by the wood stove, watching the stars through the openings in the roof where the trees grew through. In the morning, she would hike out, return to the valley, spend the winter in her farmhouse. But she'd be back. They all would be. This was family land now, reclaimed and cherished, a place that told the truth about who the Mearseys were and what they valued. The cabin would wait through the winter, solid and patient, holding its stories. And when spring came, when the snow melted and the forest woke, the family would return to this place between earth and sky, to this memorial, built by a mother's love and a son's unfinished dreams. Aura locked the cabin door, though in truth, any Mearsey was welcome to break the lock if they needed shelter and shouldered her pack. The hike out was easier than the hike in had been months ago. She was stronger now, more certain, more at peace. At the trailhead, she turned back one last time, looking toward the forest that had taken her son and then, finally, given him back. The trees stood black against the pale sky, keeping their secrets and their promises in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered to the forest, to the cabin she couldn't see but knew was there, to her son resting in the earth he'd loved. Then Aura Mearsey, 72 years old and stronger than anyone had given her credit for, walked toward her truck and home, carrying the peace she'd earned through stubbornness, love, and the courage to finish what others thought impossible. The cabin stood. The family was healing. Emmett's dream was real, and that was enough.